Hello. Um, it's good to be here. At least that's the usual thing people say at the start of a talk like this. In this case, though, it's more emotional and good. And the reason that it's emotional is that Dan Johnson, who's the father of Dexter Johnson, a 15-year-old boy you see here, is in the front row below me. And he's the person whose work has led to me being here. Dexter, his son, was put on a low dose of Prozac unbeknownst to Dan. Got worse than that, the dose was increased. He got worse again, the dose was increased further, and he became suicidal, and the dose was increased further. And a little over a year ago, as a result of this, it seems to me, having read the records, Dexter is no longer with us. Prozac, I think, caused Dexter to kill himself. In his efforts to get to grips with what had happened, Dan has reached out to a number of people, including me. So this lecture, at this point, is paying an acknowledgement to Dexter and Dan. The usual thing here in a place like the University of Lethbridge in Alberta is to acknowledge the First Peoples who are here, the Blackfoot, the Shoshone, and other First Peoples. I will be acknowledging them at the end of the talk and tying Dexter's case into theirs as well. Now, the title of the talk, Beware of Doctors Bearing Gifts, will echo for many of you, I'm sure, the story of the Trojan horse. The key word in the title is the word gifts. It'll become a little clearer towards the end of the talk why that's the key word and what gifts means. When I have a title like this, and when I say, as I will say during the course of the talk, that the art of medicine is about bringing good out of the use of a poison, many of you may think I'm anti-drugs and I'm anti the medical model. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm one of the most pro-medical model people that I know, and I believe in the use of drugs. I don't use anything else. I think you should be using other things. But a belief in the fact that drugs can help us doesn't mean using them the whole time. It means knowing when not to use them. So the talk, in a sense, starts here with this article in the New York Times at the end of last August, which said that teens in the United States, many of them, are now on up to 10 psychotropic drugs, and they're not getting better from this. And the questions were, how come they're ending up on so many drugs, and why aren't these drugs helping them? Everybody who commented on the article, and there were thousands, said, yes, this is the case, that this is the way things are. And even the New York Post, who rarely agree with the New York Times, agreed this was the case. But no one really got to grips with why it's happening and what we should be doing about it. Hopefully this talk will shed some light on that and shed some light on what happened to Dexter also. The road to our children, our teenagers being on loads of drugs and Dexter's death, I think, begins with this article here from 1990, where 3 clinicians from Harvard described 6 cases of people who'd gone on Prozac and become suicidal, and they attributed this to the fluoxetine, also called Prozac. Now, in terms of the way we establish cause and effect in medicine, this article nailed it. There was no doubt but that Prozac can cause some people to become suicidal. It can be very good for other people. Some people will become suicidal on it. The authors reported on 6 cases of people who got taken off the drug and lived to tell the tale. They didn't mention the 14-year-old boy with OCD who had actually committed suicide on fluoxetine that they were aware of. A paper that came out from Yale a short while afterwards dealt with children who were put on this drug. And these authors reported 6 cases also of children becoming suicidal on this drug. But this was 6 out of 42 people treated. So 1 in every 7 of these teenagers who were put on fluoxetine became suicidal on it, according to these authors here. There were about 10 or 20 articles that came out around this time over the course of a year or so, saying much the same thing. And I contributed to this debate with this article here, describing the case of 2 men who had been put on Prozac, become suicidal on it, The problem cleared up when the drug was removed and came back when a related SSRI drug, that Prozac is one of the SSRI group of antidepressants, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So when these men were put on a related drug, they also became suicidal again. And in their case, there was no easy way to explain what was happening other than the drug had caused the problem. Now, I'm going to call my article and the 10 or 12 or 20 or more articles that there had been previously, I'm going to call these evidence-based medicine. It was evident the drug had caused the problem, established by the usual means of trying to establish cause and effect in medicine. In the same week, close to the same week that my article came out, this article here came out where Eli Lilly, who make Prozac, analyzed their clinical trial database, their randomized clinical trial database, the RCTs that they had done on this drug to get it on the market. And they claimed that when they analyzed their RCTs, there was no evidence that Prozac could cause people to commit suicide. So they said that all the reports that you've been seeing that this drug can cause problems, well, they're anecdotes. And they reminded us that the plural of anecdote is not data. They told us it's the disease, depression, not the drug that's causing the problem. And the final and key point was they're saying that RCTs are the science of cause and effect. And if an RCT hasn't shown that this happens, then there's really no evidence that it has happened. And the challenge to patients like you who might be put on one of these drugs, who think the drug might be causing you to become suicidal, and to doctors like me who might think so as well, and to the wider public and politicians and the media, was, what are you going to believe, the science or the anecdotes? The word that will be used now is misinformation. This was the first article that created evidence-based medicine. Now, the contrast here between what I've told you was evidence-based medicine is this, that in the case of evidence-based medicine, like the report that I did and others did, we weren't saying that this is the only way to establish this. RCTs can be useful. And as it turns out, Lilly had cooked the books. And when you got access to the data behind their trials, you could see that Prozac does, in their trials, cause people to commit suicide. So there's no real clash between evidence-based medicine, as I've outlined it, and evidence-based medicine. I'm prepared to accept RCTs can be a helpful club to have in the golf bag, but if you're going to play a good round of golf, you don't want just one club. Whereas in contrast, Lilly are saying to us, to you, if you're on the drugs and think there's a problem, and to me, that our views are invalid, that the only thing that counts is the randomized controlled trials that they've done. And the problem with this isn't just that they're saying it, but that the people who make the guidelines and the regulators of drugs and the politicians like Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden and the Pope and everybody else goes along with Lilly and not with what I've told you. So we've got a situation where you're going to have to decide, and it's not really a case of a vote, but you're going to have to decide which of the arguments you're hearing here is right or not. And I'm not, the way the deck of cards is actually stacked at the moment, it's hard for people to believe, a few people like Dan, who had the experience with his son, and me, who were saying one thing, and everybody else saying the other. It's hard for you to agree with our point of view. So really, what I want you to do is go away and think about the issues and think about them again and again and again, and try and chase them until you're comfortable yourself with what's the right view for you. What's going on here to some extent is caught in this advert here, where Janssen are playing on an age-old distinction between the art and the science of medicine. The art is supposedly the good bedside manner, taking a detailed interview, which people in the human sciences will say to us is context-rich. But according to Lilly and Janssen, the science of medicine is RCTs, which are confounder-free. And that's a hard science compared with the soft stuff about the good bedside manner. But my point is this, that the evidence-based medicine involves hard judgment calls Evidence-based medicine doesn't. But evidence-based medicine festoons drugs with figures, numbers, and that looks like science, whereas your judgment call if you're on a pill, or my judgment call if I'm treating you about talking, these are hard scientific judgment calls. And a medicine that doesn't include those is going to alienate us all. It's not going to be fair. Instead, we're going to get an easy option for doctors, which is just do as they're told by the pharmaceutical companies and the guideline makers and the regulators. A lot of this all goes to the heart of what is science. Now, this may sound to you like almost theology these days, and you're not the person who's going to decide these issues, but let me take you into the history and show you that you are. The history of science traditionally goes back to 1660 with the foundation of the Royal Society. And this was the first scientific group, and they said, look, we're not dealing with the meaning of life. We're not dealing with theology. We're not dealing with philosophy. We're dealing with issues that can be settled with data. Whether you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or Jew or atheist, you've got to leave all of that at the door. You've got to leave the Bible and the Quran and everything else at the door and come into the room and look at the experiment happening in the apparatus in front of you. And as a group, you've got to come to a consensus as to what the best explanation is, the best verdict, the best diagnosis for what you see happening in front of you. And if we all agree, we're saying that that's a scientific fact. We're not saying it's true for all time. The whole point behind science is it's not true for all time. It's provisional, but it's the best view at the moment that explains the facts. Now, when that history is told, people focus on the phrase settled by data, and in particular on the word data. In the experiments you see here, there were no data, there were no numbers, there were no figures, but people focus on the word data. And I'm asking you to focus on the word settled and saying that that's more important than the numbers. The judgment calls are what makes this science. There's a part of the history that gets left out that happened 40 years earlier, when Walter Raleigh had his head chopped off for treason. Now, it was recognized afterwards that he was convicted on the basis that people said things about what he'd said and done with some Europeans, and this was treasonous, but they didn't come into court to be examined and cross-examined. And the legal system in the UK and worldwide afterwards agreed that the only evidence that should count in a court case is what the people in the jury, a group of 12, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, and Jews, and things like that, see in front of them. They can't bring the Bible or the Quran into the courtroom, and they shouldn't be bringing gossip or hearsay into the courtroom either. So they come to a view, they're asked to come to a consensus view on the basis of what they see being examined and cross-examined in front of them. And that's a best explanation for what they're seeing, which is provisional. No one says it's true for all time. If other facts turn up later, the court reserves its right to have a new trial and see what jurors then think. But that's the same as science. That's good science. Now, let me bring it home to you. Let's say Jennifer Williams, who asked me here today, and who's in the front row also, she's the lady in the white coat. She, let's say 30 years ago when Prozac had just come out, she'd come to me and I'd been her doctor for a while, and she knew me and she trusted me, and I knew her and knew her background and had all of her medical records. And she said she was feeling off color and she'd heard about Prozac and could she try it? And I said, well, yes, okay. And I gave Jennifer Prozac. And let's say a week later, she comes back to me and says, look, this is weird. I'm having strange thoughts, unlike anything I've ever had before, thoughts about killing myself. And I listened to her and we worked out, could there be anything else going on? At the end, we sort of figured it's probably the Prozac. Among our options at that point would be to halt the dose, introduce an antidote. There are some antidotes that could be used. If the problem cleared up and we were brave, we could reintroduce it to see what happened. And the other thing we could do is Jennifer and I could have a case conference, and all of you in the audience could have a chance to ask her questions also. We're aiming at a consensus view. What's the likeliest explanation to account for what's happened, Jennifer? And let's say between us, we agree that it's the Prozac that caused this problem. Well, then Jennifer and I can report her case to FDA in the United States or Health Canada here. And if we do, the first thing that happens is that the regulator removes her name and my name from the report. They convert it into hearsay, misinformation. If 30 years later, Dan, trying to work out what's happened, Dexter wants to take a legal action against someone and goes to a court and says there are tens of thousands of reports of people becoming suicidal on SSRIs, Prozac and other drugs from this group. There's loads of evidence that I would like to bring into court. The court will say to him that, you can't. This is just hearsay. There's no names there. There's no one that can be brought into court to be examined or cross-examined. If, on the other hand, when Jennifer and I concluded that the Prozac had caused the problems, we wrote this up in the form of a case report and went through all the details about other thoughts we had about what might be going on and ways we tried to see whether the Prozac was the most likely cause, and sent it to a medical journal who agreed to publish it. Then that article with our names on it means that we could be brought into court. And this is evidence that Prozac has caused the problem, but evidence that a jury can look at and can see Jennifer and me being cross-examined and try and work out how credible they think we are. And that then will let them, weigh all that up when they're trying to come to a judgment about what happened in the case of Dexter and Dan. So let me give you one more example just about this before we move on to a different area of the talk. This is a 13-year-old boy, Matt Miller, who had just changed schools. And like a lot of kids, in the first week in a new school was a bit anxious. So his parents took him along to a doctor who said, look, we can give you Zoloft. And during the week Matt was on the Zoloft, there are all sorts of reports from his grandmother and other people that he seemed very agitated on it, much more than he had been before he went on it. At the end of a week on it, Matt hung himself in the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his own bedroom. Now, it seemed very evident to me from the reports of people who had seen Matt during this week when he was on the drug that the drug had caused Matt. Now, this was the best explanation for why Matt had gone on to commit suicide. Pfizer, looking around for a different explanation about what had happened, sent investigators to comb the carpet in at the bathroom. They were looking for semen because their argument was that this was autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong in a 13-year-old boy. Before we had the internet and 13-year-old boys could maybe find out about these things. It seemed crazy to me. It seemed evident that the view I'd offered that the Zoloft had caused the problem was the correct one. And the judge said the Pfizer explanation was crazy too, but that she couldn't admit my view because independent experts had told her that the science of cause and effect lay in randomized controlled trials, and Pfizer's randomized controlled trials didn't show a problem. Now, this was wrong in that Pfizer cooked the books exactly the same way that Lilly did. And 3 years later, FDA tried taking efforts to uncook the books, put a black box warning on these drugs for kids like Matt Miller and others right up to the age of 25. But what I want to show you is this, the idea that randomized controlled trials will show you the true thing a drug does. Let's say you broke your ankle, your right ankle, and went along to the ER department who said, we're running an RCT of plaster casts. Will you agree to get involved? And you say yes. And they apply a plaster cast to your left wrist. Now, in other people's cases, they'll put it on the right wrist or the left ankle, and in some cases on the right ankle. Well, in a trial like that, plaster casts will beat placebo. But practicing medicine on the basis of this kind of evidence would be crazy. you've got to do the evident thing, put the plaster cast on the ankle that's broken. And that's, again, the contrast where judges and others seem to think, the science is not something they can have a view about when they're facing a case like Matt Miller. Whatever the clinical trials show, there was no other way to explain what happened to Matt Miller other than the Zoloft caused him to commit suicide. So one of the things that comes up is that people blame industry, and industry do a lot of tricky things, and they're not totally blameless. But my point is, even if done by angels, RCTs are not the science of cause and effect. They can be helpful, but they shouldn't invalidate what you and I think, and in particular, you who's on a drug thinks. So let me take you to a really good industry trial. Now, that may sound like irony when you hear what's coming next, but this was a trial run in university hospitals in North America, down in the States, up here in Canada. There's even a Liberal Party senator on the authorship line here, Stan Kutcher, who's in the middle of line 2. The other people on the authorship line are very distinguished people, the people who you'd have confidence in and say, if they say Paxil works well as they did, and it's free of problems in this journal, which is the highest impact factor in child psychiatry, doctors are going to believe it. Now, this article came out in 2001. The trial finished in 1998. And in 1998, GlaxoSmithKline internally, and this is part of one page of a 6-page document, which I'll show you how to get if you want. But what they're saying is we recognize that Paxil didn't work in this trial. And they also thought it wasn't safe. So what were they going to do? They were going to pick out the good bits of Study 329 and publish them. And that's what you're seeing in the paper you've just seen. Now, when this document found its way to the Attorney General in New York State, his office immediately thought, this proves fraud. The company knew what they were doing, and they took a fraud action against GSK. The document also was used by the Department of Justice in an action they took afterwards. And this was resolved with GSK paying $3 billion, the highest resolution amount of money in corporate history at that point. My interest in the document isn't just that. It led colleagues and I to get access to the data behind Study 329, much more data than FDA ever see when they're approving any drug across medicine, our Health Canada. And we ultimately got this article published in the BMJ, and it's the only study which has 2 articles published saying exactly the opposite things. The Keller paper, the one you've seen before, just report on the data from the first 8 weeks of this trial. We also report on that. They claimed the data showed the drug worked. We're saying there's no way you can cut the data, and we tried it in a few different ways that shows the drug worked. Keller and colleagues did not publish the 6-month follow-up data that came from this trial. We did, and again, there's no evidence from the continuation phase that this drug worked. So the interest in the trial, as it turned out, was not the issue about whether the drug worked, but what were the harms. In the Keller paper you've seen, they said 6 children became emotionally labile. If you read the article, most doctors like me at the time reading the article wouldn't have really known what that meant. The small print showed you that it might include some children becoming suicidal, and you might have guessed if you read the article in detail that there were 4 children in the paroxetine arm of the trial that became emotionally labile, not all of them necessarily actually becoming suicidal, and 2 in the placebo arm. This is 4 out of 93 children. So we had a look at the data, and when we accessed the raw data, we were able to show that there were 18 children who had significant behavioral events that could have all been coded as emotional lability. That is, 1 in 5 children taking Paxil in this trial. And this is just the Paxil arm that I'm talking about. It's not the imipramine or the placebo arm. And most of the emotionally labile cases were children who become suicidal, are aggressive, are manic. This was fairly serious stuff. The real message from the trial, at least for me, is that RCTs are the gold, they're usually called the gold standard way to know what a drug does. They're the gold standard way to hide harms, to make sure that people don't know what a drug does. And coding dictionary is one of the ways. I'm just going to describe quickly 3 ways that things can be hidden. The coding dictionary, which let GSK say that children who are suicidal were emotionally labile, that's a coding dictionary that FDA had never heard about. It's legitimate to do what GSK did, but, it's the first act of authorship. The way you code things like this is the first act of authorship in the scientific study of giving a drug to kids or anyone else. And no one, no journal, no regulator, no anyone ever asked to look at the way these events were coded. Once they're coded in a particular way, the paper almost writes itself. Now, in terms of our paper, what you're seeing here on the right-hand side is that the last 3 sentences here are the concluding sentences in the paper. I'm pretty sure there's no other scientific article in medicine that ever says anything like this. Almost all the industry articles, at least, talk about the results of a trial like Moses bringing down the 10 commandments from the mountain, which tell you, here is what you have to do. And the only job now for doctors to do is to prescribe the drugs, and for patients is to take them. Whereas our findings in this trial open up more questions than offered answers. And that's what good science should do. It should open up new questions. Let me give you one more bit about coding. In a Pfizer trial around this time, there was a man who became intensely agitated on the Pfizer drug, intended to kill himself, poured gasoline on himself, set fire to it, but only died from his burns in hospital 5 days later. Now, if a person dies in hospital, or there's a serious event like this, the company is supposed to write up a 1 or 2 page narrative about what happened, which would let FDA and Health Canada know that death by burns, which is how Pfizer coded this, might not be the right coding. It possibly should have been suicide instead of burns. But the narrative, which I've looked through, but I don't know whether FDA have, is a key thing. In study 329, there were 4 children who went missing completely, one of whom was a 15-year-old boy who went on Paxil and 2 weeks later was out in the street with a gun, waving it around, threatening to kill people. He was picked up by the police and brought to hospital. This is almost certainly caused by Paxil. Brought to hospital, there should be a narrative, given how serious this was and the fact that he ended up in hospital, there should be a 1 or 2 page narrative to tell FDA and Health Canada what happened here. There isn't. The companies had found a loophole back then that let them hide things like this, so that FDA saw nothing that would alert them to the fact that they should look more closely into this boy's case. I happen to have, by accident, found material which told me what I've just told you. That loophole is still there 30 years later, and in clinical trials done to this day, FDA and Health Canada let companies use this loophole, and you can see it in the way the trials are written up, to hide serious problems. So let me take you back to non-transcription. As I said, we got to see more of the raw data than FDA or Health Canada ever see. And when we did, we found that at least 1 in 6 of the side effects that children taking Paxil vanished. They didn't come over from the raw data into the company report about what the trials showed. So they were all together. Keller and his group of authors found Paxil had 250 side effects in this trial, in the kids just on it. We found 500, roughly, side effects in the children taking Paxil in this trial, which is much too many to lay out in a 10-page paper. So you've got to group these, and you can group the cardiac problems on the drugs into a cardiac group, or the respiratory problems into a respiratory drug group, or the behavioral problems into, well, GSK decided they were going to put them in a neurological group, but they could have also put them in a behavioral group. Putting them into a neurological group mixed them in with headaches, which are very common, and dizziness, which is very common. And this drowned out the signal of the behavioral effects of Paxil. When you took the behavioral effects out and put them in their own group, it was immediately clear that Paxil had a totally different profile to imipramine or placebo. Now, when an article goes to the BMJ for publication or for review, there's usually 2 reviewers and it gets reviewed once, maybe twice. We had 7 reviewers for our article. We also had it reviewed 7 times, and it was sent to GSK as well. The BMJ sent it to GSK. We also had sent the article to GSK. But the problem wasn't with our reviewers. The problem was with the research editor. And the paper took a year to get published. And the research editor, who was Elizabeth Loader, as I say, was a stumbling block. And she had a problem with us moving the behavioral events out of the neurological group. So we Googled her. And we found she's a neurologist who specializes in headaches. And that's fine. She's run trials for GSK on their drugs for headaches. And that's fine, because I've also run trials for GSK. The interesting thing, though, in her case was that her husband worked for Ropes and Gray, with a company who had defended GSK in the $3 billion legal action that they were involved in with the Department of Justice. When we pointed this out to the BMJ, all of a sudden our article got published. Now, if you want to find out everything about what I've been saying here, including all of the documents and the reviews from BMJ and things like that, you can go to study329.org, which gives you everything. The other place you can get everything from is from this book, Children of the Cure. Now, let's change gear a bit. In 2002, a year after the Keller article comes out, Newsweek had this front cover. They're telling us that 3 million teenagers in the United States are depressed, and they're going to go on to a life of crime and drug abuse and failed marriages and failed careers and suicide. But the good news is that FDA have just approved Prozac for kids who are depressed, and Newsweek know that FDA are just about to approve Paxil and Zoloft, which may come as a surprise to many people listening to this talk here, because everybody knows Paxil and Zoloft are not approved for kids who are depressed. Only Prozac is. So, and again, you can get the full document here on study329.org. What FDA are saying in this response to GSK, this is an FDA letter essentially approving Paxil for children who are depressed. And what they're saying to GSK is, we agree, you've told us that study 329 and these other 2 studies are negative, and we agree with you that they're all negative, but we're still going to approve Paxil for children who are depressed. And they go on to say, we agree with GSK's proposal that we shouldn't mention in the labeling of the drug that these trials were negative. Why would FDA do this? Well, a few years later, there was an article by Eric Turner, who used to work for FDA. And this is looking at the publications from the adult trials of 10 years earlier of all these drugs. And the publications universally say these drugs work wonderfully well and are safe. When you see publications like this appearing in the very best journals, you'd say, well, look, it's really my duty to take this drug, even if I'm not depressed. But Turner had worked in FDA beforehand, and he knew that FDA's view of what was going on was quite different. And FDA had come to a view about many of these trials that the companies had done were negative. Some weren't published at all. But the really interesting thing was 1/3 of the trials published as positive were, in fact, according to FDA, negative, like study 329. Now, why would FDA say nothing about the studies published as positive the way study 329 was, when in fact FDA and the company had told them that the trial was negative. Well, I'm going to go on to that. I'm going to go on to the issue about what's FDA's job now in a moment. But before I do that, let me show you this. Pfizer had done loads of trials with Zoloft in people who are depressed, people who are anxious, and people with PTSD. And this is a page from a document where a group of medical writing companies are showing the status of the publications they've been asked to write on Pfizer's trials. And on the PTSD page, you see this. Now, first of all, I need to tell you, this just refers to 2 trials, but Pfizer had done 4 trials in people, adults with PTSD, all negative. The FDA approved this drug for PTSD on the basis that in 2 of the trials, there was a marginally positive benefit for women. But the point I want to make is this. If you look under status there, you'll see that these 2 trials are about to be published in the very best journals in the field. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see author TBD, to be determined. Academic authors like Marty Keller and Stan Kutcher and other people, their names are going to be put on the article in line with the perceptions of the marketing department from the company as to what's most appropriate. In the case of the Keller et al. Paper that you saw, there was something like 22 or 24 authors there, but not the name of the woman who wrote the paper. It's just not there. In the case of these articles for PTSD, again, the person who wrote the paper isn't there. And this is true. This is not just an antidepressant story. This is true for all drugs across medicine that are reporting on industry trials. They are written by medical writers, or what should be called perhaps ghostwriters. So why do FDA say nothing about this? Well, you'll all probably know that the UK tumbled out of the European Union fairly recently, about 6 years ago. There was all sorts of problems and chaos. Some of you will be old enough to remember they joined the European Union 50 years ago and almost immediately ran into problems. England's favorite chocolate, Cadbury's, the English were told that you cannot call this chocolate anymore. There wasn't enough cocoa solids in it. This led to consternation. It led to an English preoccupation with Brussels red tape that was ultimately what fueled Brexit 50 years later. What's going on here is best brought out by remembering that FDA means Food and Drugs Agency. Regulators regulate according to a standard. If your chocolate has a certain amount of cocoa solids in it, you can use the word chocolate. If your butter has a certain amount of animal fats in it, you can use the word butter. If your antidepressant shows a marginal drop in a depression rating scale, you can use the word antidepressant. In the case of chocolate, FDA are not saying this is good chocolate. In the case of butter, they're not saying butter is good for you. In the case of antidepressants, they're letting companies use the word, even though more people die on active treatment in these trials than on placebo. And there's no evidence that the drugs correct anything, but they're use the word antidepressant based on a standard, a preset agreed standard between the regulator and companies. Now, the other thing FDA don't do in the case of the antidepressant is they don't police the medical literature. That is not their job. So if you've got, as we had in around 2004, 2006, when a crisis blew up about children becoming suicidal on these drugs, if you got the fact that all of the publications on these trials claim the drugs worked well, and the fact that the data from get access to them shows just the opposite, and that the published literature is what guidelines are based on, and you've got, in this case, the biggest divide in all of science, I think, between what the published scientific claims are and what the data looks like when we get access to it. It's no wonder that we have the situation that you see in this slide. The BMJ have put the then Minister of Health, Jeremy Hunt, on the front cover because the NHS is falling apart. And he's essentially saying it is. And the worst spot is children's mental health. Well, if we've got the situation that I've just outlined to you, this is what you'd expect. You'd expect doctors in good faith putting kids on drugs that the published scientific literature says to them works. The kids would be ending up anything but improved by these pills. They'd be ending up much worse, and you'd have a hell of a mess. But part of my point is this is not just an antidepressant story. This applies across medicine to any drugs you might be taking. Now, those of you who know a little bit about antidepressants and kids will say to me, but FDA have approved Prozac, and, surely it's okay to give Prozac to children. Well, my answer is FDA approved Paxil also. Internal FDA reviews of the Prozac trials for kids said they were negative. And actually, when you look at the data from the Prozac trials and the Paxil trials, they don't look any different, really. So we've got a weird state of affairs where on one level, a lot of this is known, but on another level, people completely deny there's an issue. This is a cartoon, a Peanuts cartoon from 20 years ago or more. I've been using it for at least the last 20 years. And Lucy knows what's going on, even if FDA don't. She does the usual thing about causing problems for Charlie Brown. But in this case, his response is a very different one to the one she expects, or at least the reader expects. Now, when you go on Prozac, one of the things that could have happened to Dexter was he's just having awful thoughts about killing himself in horrible ways, or he may have had awful thoughts about killing Dan and his twin brother in horrible ways and figured the only way not to do this is to kill himself. Or he may just have been numbed. These drugs cause an emotional numbing so that you might just have the kinds of thoughts most of us have from time to time about killing ourselves, but don't ever do because we'd be too anxious to do it, or we think about the consequences. But if you're emotionally numbed on these drugs, you will often do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And Lucy knows this and knows why Charlie Brown is behaving the way he's just done, which is he's not reacting the way he should. And his non-reaction is unhealthy in this context. So it's not just a case that the harms the drugs cause can Prozac and SSRIs cause some people to commit suicide. The answer is yes, they can. But it's the change in culture that actually affects not just our kids, but all of us. Here's Bart and Homer is saying things that we'd have said to teenagers 30 years ago, or even when I was a teenager, where we expected teenagers to go half crazy as they looked out at the crazy world and worked out how they were going to find a reasonable and sane path through all of this. We figured it was a good idea that people struggled with issues like this. Now, there'll be a third panel, and I need to make a version of this cartoon that is a third panel where Bart says to Homer, "Hey, Dad, that's the 20th century. I've just done a rating scale, and my score is very high, and it tells me at the bottom there are drugs that will help me with this." Okay, so today, Homer would take Bart to a doctor on the basis of a rating scale. And the most commonly used rating scale in trials of people who are depressed is called the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And here's Max Hamilton, who created the scale 15 years earlier, saying, this is a revolutionary change, a rating scale like this. It's going to standardize things. And that can be good, there can be a good side to this, but there can also be a bad side. How could a rating scale have a bad side? Well, let me show you this cartoon here. Up to about 1980 or so, we brought problems to doctors which we wanted help with in order to live the lives we wanted to live. As of the 1980s in particular, companies were persuading the people who now ran health service companies to get us to use rating scales more often. They might be on the computer in front of us. You might hand them out to the patient before they came into the clinic, or you might do an interview based on a rating scale. Because companies know that when you use a scale like this, rather than have David Healy ask you what football results or recipes or your recent holidays or your family or whatever, that useful rating scale will mean that David Healy will help you live the life that Pfizer or other companies want you to live, not necessarily the one that you want to live. How does this happen? Well, on a rating scale like this, there's items for suicide and sleep and anxiety and being able to make love and things like this. And if I ask you the question, have you been suicidal in the last week? And you say to me, yes, I tried to kill myself, I tried to cut my wrists, I'd score you as a 4, without asking questions about did the illness or the drug cause this. And it's the same for the other items, lots of other items, that both the illness and the drug can affect. And in this case, the worse your response to the drug, the higher the score for your depression goes. And the higher the score for your depression goes, the more likely I am to increase the dose of the drug again and again and again, until if the drug is causing the problem, you kill yourself or do something else that's pretty awful. Now, this helps explain this article here, where a very common picture is you've got a teenager who becomes suicidal on one of these SSRI drugs. And the doctor says to her, this just shows you're bipolar. We need to put you on a mood stabilizer. And among the mood stabilizers, among the most common are a group of drugs called the antipsychotics. Now, what we want an antipsychotic to do normally is to cause you to lose focus, to not focus on the voices or other things that you may have been having. So we put the teenager on this, and he or she comes back a week or two later and says, yeah, I'm maybe a little bit better, but, I can't focus quite as well. And the doctor says, oh, really? And gives them an ADHD rating scale. And they tick the boxes for being unable to focus and look at the score at the bottom. And the doctor looks at the score and says, you've got ADHD. We need to put you on a stimulant, which pulls exactly the opposite way to the antipsychotic that you've been previously put on. Exactly the same way, physiologically and behaviorally, just does the total opposite. This is crazy. This is like getting the teenager to stand on a weighing scales and then putting a 25-kilogram dumbbell in each of her hands and looking down at the scale and saying, my God, you're 50 kilograms overweight. I need to put you on a pill for weight loss. It's as crazy as that. This is not just an antidepressant or psychiatric issue, it's across medicine. Industry know if we can produce numbers for your breathing rates and cholesterol levels and bone densities, that these numbers are going to pose problems for which their pills are going to look like the answer. And perhaps the best way to bring it out is to let you know that weighing scales for humans came into being in the 1860s in France. 10 years later were the first descriptions of a new illness, anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder. Weighing scales migrated into drugstores during the 1920s and came with plates on them giving your ideal weight for your height and sex. And eating disorders mushroomed. Weighing scales migrated into our bathrooms during the 1960s, and eating disorders exploded in countries that had weighing scales, and not in any other part of the world where weighing scales weren't being used for this purpose. That's not saying the weighing scales are the sole cause of the problem. It's just saying industry can make these things epidemic. Now, when we measure one thing, we can make the person doing the measuring, whether it's the patient, neurotic, or the doctor neurotic, who figures they want to treat this problem, the hypertension, that doesn't need to be treated. They want to bring the figures down. This can be a disaster. Now, at the same time as this was happening, at the same time as industry were learning they could make far more money from us by giving us drugs to take when we were well, when we didn't have an illness. These are not illnesses. They can make far more money out of this than trying to treat psychoses or heart attacks or strokes, which they're pretty poor at. At the same time as that was happening, healthcare was changing into health services. It was becoming part of the service industry rather than clinical science. And as with any service industry, it got managers. Now, up till then, people brought problems that posed risks to them to me for help, to sort of try and minimize the risk to them from the condition they had. The atmosphere, the climate within health services rapidly became quite different. Doctors like me and people like you coming to see me could feel that I now seem to be in the business of trying to minimize the risks that you might pose to the organization I worked for. So this was not helping you live the life you wanted to live. It was really changing things around to make sure that the organization was sitting pretty. My discretion and your discretion, our judgment calls, which had been the jewel at the heart of healthcare, were a problem now for managers and insurers and politicians, for whom the idea that, the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison doesn't compute. Industry will tell you that the science of management is all about we can manage what we can measure. And this produces lots of figures, and everything in health services is festooned with figures these days, and it all looks terribly scientific. But we're reproducing a 21st century version of the King Midas story. Nothing in health services these days offers the kind of care we need to stay alive. This cartoon brings it out as well, which is that, the idea that a doctor would use his or her own clinical judgment has become a big problem. And it's not just doctors, it's you as well. I want to tell you about two women. One was my mother, who had a younger baby boy after she had me, and she knew right from the start that things weren't quite right. And she took him along to the doctors who ran tests and did things and said, all our tests are normal, and told my father that here's a pill, give her this, she's become neurotic. She was right, and they were wrong. Many years later, I ended up doing medicine. And when I got there, in pediatrics in particular, the message has changed. They're saying to me and others that when you've got a baby who the mother says is ill and you run a bunch of tests and they're all normal, you still believe the mother. Now, that looked great to me, and I thought it was going to extend across all of medicine. But in actual fact, it hasn't. And not only that, even in pediatrics and neonatal care and antenatal care, mothers are not believed anymore. Their hesitation about taking drugs during pregnancy, for instance, has been wiped aside. They're told, forget your scruples and hesitancy. You've got to take all these drugs. And increasingly, led by middle-class, white, university-educated women are taking more and more of these drugs during pregnancy. A different lady came my way many, many years ago. After she'd had trouble for years, she had been put on an SSRI, had begun to drink more and more on it, crashed a car, lost a job, had a criminal charge, all sorts of things. And she concluded that the SSRI, the Paxil she was put on, was causing her alcoholism. Her doctor told her, no, that's crazy. This is alcoholic thinking. He referred it to AA, who told her, this just proves you're an alcoholic. Thinking this way just means you're an alcoholic. Turns out that she had no background in healthcare. She dropped out of school early, but she went on the internet and worked with what SSRIs do and serotonin receptors. And some years later came my way and taught me more about the serotonin system than I knew. Now, I have a PhD in the serotonin system. Here was this woman telling me more about it than I knew and showing me what drugs she needed to be changed to in order for the problem to clear up. And she was right and everybody else was wrong. And unbeknownst to everybody else, all the other doctors in AA and things like that, the only other people who agreed with her were pharmaceutical companies who were operating on the same theories that she had now worked out. Okay, she taught me that motivation is worth more than expertise, or at least as much. And that rather than have 100 patients who are causing me problems because I've kept to the guidelines, but they didn't seem to be getting better, if I listened to and looked at patients, I could have 100 free research assistants who make the job much more fun. I've said to you repeatedly, this is not just an antidepressant story. Some of the drugs that are used for asthma can cause your children or adults to become suicidal. Some of the drugs used for acne, which teenagers may take, definitely make you suicidal. And in the case of isotretinoin or Accutane, can also wipe out your ability to make love forever. In the case of these antibiotics listed here, and there are loads more, they can cause a mental illness, and it's almost for sure your doctor won't recognize these caused it and will give you the wrong treatments, thinking you've got a different kind of mental illness. Finasteride, which young men like Donald Trump, but also really, real young men, take for hair loss, can cause you to grow more hair, but can also make you suicidal and cause you to be unable to make love again, ever again. Antihistamines are interesting. Many of these are serotonin reuptake inhibiting. All of the SSRIs are antihistamines. If you get a serotonin reuptake inhibiting antidepressant over the counter and feel lousy or weird on it, your instant reaction will be to stop it. If you get one from your doctor who says, you need to keep taking these drugs, and in fact, maybe we should increase the dose, you're in a much trickier situation. Now, when FDA approve drugs these days, they claim to do so on a benefit-risk ratio basis. It's a bit like, let's say you think about a randomized control trial of parachutes. The guys with the parachutes jumping out of planes survive. The guys without the parachutes die unless by chance they fall into a tree or whatever. Some problems can happen on a parachute for men. The harness may be too tight down there, and you may have problems for a few days afterwards. But on a benefit-risk basis, the single commonest thing that happens is these things save lives. And yes, there are problems, but they are minimal compared with the benefit. And FDA are giving you the impression that this is true of all of the drugs they approve, when in fact in SSRI trials, more people died on the SSRI than on placebo. And in fact, in SSRI trials, that, the single commonest thing that happens half an hour after your first pill is you will be genitally numb or irritable. And this, if you're on the pill for weeks, it's going to interfere with the way you make love. And you'll be thinking, well, it'll be good when I can stop because I'll be able to get back to making love normally, but you may not be able to stop. Or if you are, the problem may get much worse, what we call post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And you may never be able to make love again, or it may be at least months or years before you're able to make love. So that's the commonest thing that happens. That's a pretty important thing. FDA are saying that a minor drop in a rating scale score trumps that. And I don't see how they can possibly say that. The thing is, it was so hard to detect whether SSRIs were any use at all, that the focus on that benefit, the rating scale change, was so intense that people missed what the single most obvious thing these drugs do was. Let me explain it a different way by telling you about a man I had who had OCD, for which SSRIs are the treatment that's usually used first. They failed in his case, as they often do, so we went on to some more heavy-duty treatment, which also failed. But some weeks later, he was back in my clinic and he was cured. This was the man who needed his OCD to be cured because it was key to the job he was doing, that he was able to function. So I was asking him what had helped him, and he said he'd halted all of the drugs that I put him on. And that wasn't what had helped him. I mean, it helped, but it was not the key thing. The key thing was he'd gone back smoking. He hadn't just done that. He then Googled nicotine and OCD and found there are lots of trials showing nicotine can be very good for OCD, just as good as an SSRI. That doesn't mean we should use nicotine before SSRIs. It means there's going to be some people for whom nicotine's the right answer and other people for whom SSRIs may be a help. He'd also Googled other drugs related to nicotine, and they were helpful too. So two things. One is, when I say the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison, doctors hiss at me. But you can see in this man's case, the art of medicine, in his case, was bringing good out of the use of what we would all agree is a poison, right? And SSRIs are on prescription only because we've every reason to believe they're more dangerous than nicotine and alcohol, which are available over the counter. But the key point here is this: who is in the best position to decide on a benefit-risk ratio whether nicotine is good for this man to take? Is it him or FDA? And my view is that it's him. The person who's on the drug is the only person who can work out whether I'm getting something good out of this poison and whether it trumps the problems that I'm trying to use the poison for. And if it does, you're in the best position, perhaps with, having had some input from me or some other doctor to say, well, do you know about the risks of nicotine? If you do, and things like that, yes, you're in at the best position and are likely to figure that, you really shouldn't be on this for all the rest of your life. But you're in a better position than FDA, I think. So on this slide, you see three women. The lady in the middle is a pilot. If there's a problem on a flight she's on, she'll report it, and the system will fix the problem, because if it doesn't, they know that neither she nor her colleagues are going to fly again. Not necessarily because they're worried about you and I, but because if we die, they're going to die too. So the system fixes the problem. On the right, you've got Jane Fraser, who's the CEO of Citibank in New York, and she began her rise to the top during the financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis was one which we now look at the behavior of bankers and say, well, there was a state of moral hazard here, that they were outsourcing risks to you and me, mortgages that they knew were dodgy. But they also knew or felt that, well, if things go wrong, we were the people who were going to have a problem, not them. They were going to continue to get a lot of pay and high bonuses. This is a situation where it's hard for them to do the right or the brave thing. The lady on the left is a doctor, and she prescribes drugs in the same way as bankers give us mortgages. She puts them in our mouth. She's outsourcing risk. If there's a problem we have and she reports it, no one pays any heed to it. FDA and Health Canada file it away and nobody ever looks at it again. She's in a situation of moral hazard where it's very difficult for her to do the right thing, particularly if it involves if it involves bravery. Just as we had the financial crisis, we are heading towards a pharmaceutical crisis. If you look at this graph from the New York Times and look at just the early 1980s, the time when industry began treating us, even though we were healthy, with pills, getting us to consume more and more drugs, and the time that healthcare was replaced by health services, life expectancy has been falling since, and in particular, before COVID, was dropping dramatically. I think the main factor driving this is likely to be polypharmacy, as I'm going to explain to you. But just before I do, let me introduce you to this phrase here, which is Paracelsus, who is the man who gave rise to the phrase, the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison. Medicine was all about believing this to the point of putting poison symbols on many drugs. Now, drugs are viewed as sacraments, and there are serious proposals to stamp pills like the antidepressants with an image of a pregnant woman to get over her hesitancy about taking pills during pregnancy. But the key thing here is the word gift. When Paracelsus was talking about poisons and the art of medicine, the German for poison is gift. So when I say to you, beware doctors bearing gifts, you perhaps now appreciate a little bit more what I was getting at. So all drugs, just like all arms or guns, are a technique. They're amoral. The good or the bad that gets brought out of them is down to us. That's where the morality lies, whether we use them to enhance ourselves or diminish ourselves. So I don't mean as individuals, I mean as a group. They also give rise to an arms race. The country that had the best guns won. In the same way, the country that kept its troops alive, that they didn't succumb to diseases and wounds and things like that, was more likely to win the war than the company who had lost too many troops through disease. So the military has had a huge input into health, into developing drugs and health techniques. There's two other aspects to this here. One is that as the nuclear bomb shows us, there's a limit to effectiveness. Yes, it creates an arms race, but we can get to a point where things are so effective we can't use them. And a curious way we've got to that point with drugs also, as I'm going to show you. But one more thing to bear in mind is a drug is not just a chemical and we improve the chemical. It comes with information that tells us how to use it. And in this case, the information is being degraded the whole time. What's happening is our propaganda techniques have become hugely better than they were before. So we're consuming worse and more dangerous drugs than we ever were before, but we're told, hey, there's no problem here. They come at a higher price for industry. And it's debatable whether enhanced propaganda techniques can ever enhance us or can only diminish us. As you've seen, life expectancy in the United States and a lot of the Western world is now falling. In the United States, 6 years ago, 40% of over 45s were on 3 or more drugs, 40% of over 65s were on 5 or more drugs. We know that if we reduce the number of drugs you're on from 10 or whatever down towards 5 or ideally towards 3, that we're going to reduce the rates at which you go into hospital, we're going to increase life expectancy, and you're going to have a better quality of life. Over 3 drugs, you're not going to get the effectiveness of each of those drugs as you would get from each of them on their own. Effectiveness falls off. If we try to reduce your drugs, though, we potentially have a problem that this still from the Hurt Locker movie brings out, which is that it can be terribly hard to know which of the drugs to drop first. Many of the drugs you'll be on are ones you can't get off easily. You'll be hooked to, and it may be impossible to get off them. In a situation like this, there is never going to be any RCTs to tell the doctor you see here what to do next. There's going to be no guidelines which are going to guide him or her. There's a group of people, if he's able to talk in the walkie-talkie to his colleagues elsewhere who have been in this kind of situation, they may be able to offer a little bit of help. But the key person who can help him is you. You are on these pills. You know what happens when there's a tweak on any of the pills, whether it seems easy to get off it or reduce the dose, or whether you just can't. Things get much worse and rockier, and you're hoping that it's not going to explode. It's going to require great teamwork between you and him. Now, I have one more comment on this that I was only going to put in. It's 2 slides too many. But on the world stage yesterday, there was a dramatic event. And one of the key players in this event said the following. And you could say this applies to the doctor and the patient, you, who is in the situation you've just looked at with all these bombs and trying to work out how to defuse them. This person said there's no mathematical basis for decisions like this. We have to move step by step. It's right that we don't just impulsively do something. Now, I'm not taking a stance in the war going on at the moment, but the person who said this was Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, who is deciding on whether to give tanks to Ukraine. I'm sure that Olaf Scholz would think, yeah, there's no mathematical basis for decisions like this in the case of tanks. But I suspect that he, like Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden and the Pope, would say, yes, there is a mathematical basis for the use of SSRIs. And there isn't. That's the point I'm trying to make, which is exactly the same situation applies to drugs as the guy in the Hurt Locker shows you, as it does with bombs and tanks. Now, you might say to me, a tank shell is a lot more damaging than an SSRI capsule. It might look like a tiny tank shell, but in fact, when you take an SSRI, there's very little serotonin in your brain or mine. Most of it's in your gut or your bloodstream or your skin or your bones, very little in your brain. There's more in your genitals. And if you're male and you're on them, they're going to wipe out your sperm count. So taking SSRI is rather like a tank shell blitzing your entire body. These are not magic bullets which just go to one spot that your doctor and you hope will fix the problem. There's another factor at play here, which is very Canadian in a sense, which is if you try to reduce medication burden for people here in Canada, the people and the health system and other doctors are going to resist this approach. The general system view is that people expect to get more drugs and expect to get more diagnostic labels, which is partly why we get teens on 10 psychotropic drugs, as you've seen. It used to be the case that you had to be wealthy to get treated to save your life. Now you've got to be wealthy. You've got to be able to get outside the public health system if you want to get off medicines in order to save your life. Canada leads the way in medical assistance in dying. I've got no moral problems with this. I've got a different view about how we might best do it, I am concerned about the young women in particular in Belgium and Holland who seem to be getting made for treatment-resistant depression, which is almost certainly caused by the 10 pills or more that they're taking. There never was an illness like this before we began giving drugs at the rate we are giving them. My moral concern lies with a system that will give us every health service up to and including MAID, except the service of helping us get off medicines in order to save our life, if that's what we want. Now, in the midst of all this gloom and problems, I have to let you know that there is a little bit of hope. This is one of my researchers who taught me a lot about the point I'm going to make, which is, she's also from an Arthurian legend. And Arthur is out in the woods one day and meets a black knight who challenges him to a duel and beats him and is about to kill him until the black knight says, might be more fun to give you a riddle. And if you can come back with an answer to the riddle in a year's time, I'll spare your life. But if you don't have the answer, you're dead. So the riddle is, what do women most desire? Arthur goes back to his court and sends people out around the country asking, what's the answer to this question? What do women most desire? But a year later, they still don't have the answer. And they're on the way back to meet the Black Knight. And they meet this lady on the edge of the road who says, I have the answer to the riddle. But for me to give you the answer, you've got to give me one of your knights as my husband. And so Gawain jumps down and says, yes, I'm happy to be this lady's husband, Your Honor. And she gives Arthur the answer, who gives the Black Knight the answer, who has to let Arthur go. So they all go back to the court, and a day or two later, Gawain's marriage to the loathly lady happens. And you can see that everybody in the court is very unhappy and wondering what's going to happen when they go up to the bedchamber. Well, when they go up to the bedchamber, he can't bear to look at her, but she takes control. And he turns around and finds one of the most interesting women and attractive women that he's ever seen. And she gives him a riddle. Do you want me to look like this in the bedchamber with you at night and the way I was looking by day in court? Or do you want me to look like this in court during the day and the way I was looking in the bedchamber with you at night? And he has no idea what the answer to this is and says, whatever you want, which turns out to be the right answer to both riddles, which is that she, like the rest of us, wants to control her own life. She might want our help with a problem she has in life. Chances are she knows more about how to live life than any doctor she might go to, or even any knight that she might go to. And she doesn't need to be told how to live her life. In this case, what you've got, if I look at her and listen closely to her, because she's the apparatus in which the experiment is happening. And if between us we try and come to a consensus view about what's the best way to explain what's happening, and in particular, if I've left the New England Journal of Medicine and regulatory guidance and all these kind of things outside the bedchamber, there's a chance that we can do science. And science in this case involves creating an us, an embryo community. It's totally different if I do evidence-based medicine. If I'm wondering what the books out of the door say, I should be saying to this lady, that has me relating to a false person. I mean, an average person, an average non-existent person. And at best, it's going to create a false we rather than the us that comes out of doing science. And as I've said, treating people this way gives doctors 100 free research assistants as opposed to 100 false relationships. This is a moral issue. It's not just about what does it mean to do science. It's all about creating communities. And let me come back to the Blackfoot and the first peoples who lived here, who were here before the white men came. And this is an image that speaks to that, at the middle of which is a spiral wampum, a two-spiral wampum, which is a symbol of building trust and a community. Now, Paracelsus said the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison. He also said, nature is my book, something that the first peoples here, I think, would probably have agreed with. If you look at the position I'm sitting in a clinic, people are my book. And again, I think the first peoples here would probably have endorsed that, because it's people, not land, that build a community and a tribe and a nation. In the image over on the left, you've got some black robes. They're religious orders who came and who told us that there was a better way for us to be living, who to some extent stole our souls, and in particular stole our children. On the right-hand side, you see some white coats. We're now in the middle of a white coat storm, and we're all of us, to some extent, first peoples now, who are being told that our judgment about the right way for us to live is no longer valid. We can't live this way. Our children are being stolen from us like Dexter was, and they often die in ways that they should not die. This is not a situation of, is not a good situation that we should tolerate. I've used the word soul. This is not a mind-body problem. This is an issue of power. Who is taking power over us? And can we resist and insist that the power that's going to shape our lives should reside with us? Thank you very much for listening.